Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at two other supply side factors, climatic and geopolitical events. I don't know why I wrote climatic twice, and the impacts of an ageing population on our supply. So firstly, climatic or geopolitical events. So what we're looking at here is things like wars, which is a geopolitical event, droughts, floods, cyclones, all of these kind of things and how they impact supply. So poor climatic conditions can basically, droughts, floods, cyclones can all kind of fit into that same sort of category. Basically what they do is they make it harder for particularly agricultural businesses to produce. It reduces the quality of our land resources, and it can lead to increased costs of production because it takes longer for farms to grow their produce. It makes it a lot harder to weakens the quality of the soil and makes it a lot harder for businesses to produce. That leads to reduced willingness to supply. It can lead to some suppliers leaving the market, and will lead to higher prices for agricultural products. It's like saying why fruit is basically more expensive when it's not in season. All of these things will lead to lower our productive capacity and our ability to supply, and they can have negative impacts on demand because it leads to higher prices and therefore less export income, basically, due to the higher costs. That will affect the income of farmers. So farmers will lose a lot of their profits, and therefore that can have indirect impacts on consumption and investment spending. Farmers won't have enough money to invest in the future, and there'll be less consumption expenditure because consumers in these industries, workers aren't making as much money, so they're spending less on consumer items. There'll be higher unemployment as well. So that leads to lower aggregate demand in the short term. Okay, basically it's harder to produce. That shifts supply to the left, leads to higher prices, unemployment, less consumption, less investment within our economy. While a lot of these sort of things can lead to reduction in aggregate demand, it's important to recognise that if something like a cyclone occurs or a natural disaster, it can actually boost aggregate demand in the short term because of the reconstruction effect. So back when we talked about the limitations of aggregate demand, I talked about the New Zealand earthquake, and the problem with this when measuring our growth is that aggregate demand often increases because we have to reinvest in houses and roads and bridges to try and so to improve businesses' quality of life. We need to repair roads so that we can still go places. Same with bridges. People want to fix their houses. So there'll be a lot more demand for builders, construction, infrastructure, a lot more government spending in the short term. So G2 will generally go through the roof after a natural disaster. And that can lead to, therefore, an increase in aggregate demand. And the good thing about boosting aggregate demand is in the long term will help to boost our investment spending, boost our productive capacity and shift aggregate supply back to the right. But it's important to recognise that any of these things will shift supply to the left in the short term, but aggregate demand may increase if it causes some form of reconstruction, especially after big natural disasters. In the case of wars reduce the quantity of labour available. It can also destroy a lot of infrastructure and have negative impacts on aggregate supply as well. So, ageing population is something that's very prevalent at the moment. So basically what we're saying is the number of Australians reaching retirement age, which is approximately 65 and above, is expected to double in the next 40 years. So we're going to have twice as many people in the 65 to 84 year age bracket. And the problem with that is it's going to lead to a lower labour force and a lower participation rate because there'll be more people over 15 that don't have a job. It's going to decrease the size of our labour force, and as we talked about with participation rates, that could lead to wage pressures, can lead to skill shortages, there's a lot less workers available, and reduced productivity may emerge because of that lack of competition for jobs, and also because a lot of these old people, maybe not her, but a lot of old people have skills that are going to be lost to the labour force, and that can lower our productive capacity and our productivity. So if there's 65-year-olds that are leaving the workforce that were very good at their jobs, that's going to lead to a reduction in productivity. All of these things are likely to cause productivity to fall and our productive capacity to fall, and that will lead to a reduction in aggregate supply. Some other problems that will emerge for our economy, so it's not just the supply side impacts, but it could lead to increased welfare because a lot of these people will go onto the pension. There'll be less people working, so we'll have a much smaller tax base, and that might lead to higher taxes in the future and could hurt aggregate demand. And all of these things can have negative impacts on economic growth. So if you get a question about how ageing population will impact economic growth, focus mainly on the size of the labour force and the negative impact it's going to have on productivity and our international competitiveness. And then also you want to make links to how it's going to may lead to higher taxes, because basically we're dependent on fewer workers for our tax base or for our taxation revenue. And all of these things are going to lead to lower economic growth. There's also a lot more people that are earning a lower income, because generally when you're on the pension you don't earn as high an income, and that will lead to lower aggregate demand as well. So you can see here the participation rate, especially from sort of 2010 to 2013, did start to fall, purely based on the fact that there were so many elderly workers in the economy. So change in participation rate, looking over, you can see that the amount of ageing people is considerably starting to rise, and therefore that's having negative impacts on our participation rate. They're more likely to leave the labour force. Okay. So here's just a quick synopsis of how to answer a question relating to an ageing population. So explain how Australia's ageing population is likely to impact on Australia's goal of strong and sustainable economic growth over the next 20 years. Okay, like always, define strong and sustainable growth. Fastest rate of growth in real GDP that promotes jobs without causing external inflationary or environmental pressures. You've got a couple of your marks. Then explain the links we were talking about before. As a high percentage of Australians leave the labour force and seek retirement, the labour participation rate is likely to fall. Okay, your next mark is making a something linked to that. 1, 2. This will reduce the competition for jobs and create skill shortages and limit our productivity. All of those links I told you to make in that last bit. Less competition, skill shortages, lower productivity. There's your second mark. The fall in supply of labour could cause wage pressures to emerge. Once you see wage pressures emerging, you should be going, alright, that's going to hurt our international competitiveness. Okay, as skilled workers leave the workforce, this will cause problems for productivity and could cause inflationary pressures because of higher wages or capacity constraints. And that will reduce our international competitiveness. And once our international competitiveness is reduced, you should be thinking exports, and you should be thinking the impact it's going to have on incomes in Australia. So this should result in fewer exports, less factor incomes because people don't want our products, reduced consumption expenditure because people lose their jobs, and a fall in aggregate demand. More people out of work will also put pressure on the budget as the government collects less money in income tax, and more people on welfare and pensions, like we talked about before. And the other problem with having a higher ageing population is the government will have less money available because they're spending so much on welfare to spend on infrastructure and G2 spending, which will also hurt our productive capacity. So defining the goal, linked to participation rates, linked to wage pressures and international competitiveness, linked to unemployment and incomes, and also the impact that it will have on the budget and welfare restraints.